Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room as we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today, we're so pleased to have my good friend, Edward Cunningham, Director of Ash Center China Programs and of the Asia Energy and Sustainability Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School. He's currently completing a book on China's energy markets and energy governance during the modern reform period. Edward, welcome.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, Wenqi. It's great to be here.
So climate change and energy security has been consistently gaining traction over the last decade or so because people are actually experiencing unusual natural disasters and fires. It's no longer just a topic limited to the scientists, environmental activists, or just Wall Street financiers. And China and the US are the world's largest CO2 emitters. That's why the world requires the two countries to actually lead on these efforts. Can you give our audience a high-level overview of the history of this bilateral collaboration, perhaps starting with the Obama administration when major climate efforts were undertaken?
Sure, that's an important sort of contextual question. The Obama administration's relationship with China on climate and on energy, I think, reflected both the promise and the challenges of that relationship, one that we all focus on. What do I mean by that? On the one hand, Presidents Obama and Xi were able to move China from a largely obstructionist global climate player during, for example, the Copenhagen summit, right, in 2009, when China was saying that it was representing the interests of the developing world, which really pitted it, in some ways, pitted against the US and much of the developed world. From that to a much more engaged partner during the Paris climate agreement that then occurred in 2015. So, what really changed? Now, if we look at that high-level review of the history, well, as a result, 193 nations collectively agreed, right, to a clear goal, keep warming at plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. The vast majority of those nations developed their own climate action plans, as the agreement called them to do, and some have even increased those goals since the agreement. If you then move forward, COP26 or Glasgow, that further detailed, and I think most people don't appreciate how important this was, critical mechanisms to collectively report, to monitor those national plans with common measurements, common metrics, to see how each nation's doing each year, develop a global carbon market, and then finally mobilize finance, right, for the developing world, which has been less successful. So I think it would have been very difficult to achieve those global agreements without the active commitment between the US and China. On the other hand, many of the seeds, this is to the challenges, right? Many of the seeds of the current trade war were also planted during the Obama administration, right? So if you think about in 2012, the raising of solar panel tariffs, so tariffs against Chinese solar panel imports and other measures, what the US was trying to do, and the Obama administration in particular, was basically alter, right, Chinese behavior in subsidies, industrial policy, IP enforcement. So that's the other side. I think those tensions began as they usually do in international trade. So a tit for tat, responding in a very limited particular industry. And then, of course, because the US levied those tariffs, then the Chinese levied similar tariffs, but on polysilicon, right, within the solar industry. And of course, under the Trump administration, that narrow trade dispute developed into a much wider trade war that continues today.
That was fascinating to hear that, because when people think about US-China relationship, especially when it comes to climate change, it tends to be something that's more positive, right? But you're exactly right. Actually, the solar panel trade tariff started in the Obama administration. So when Trump came into the government, he pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord in a big way, right? And even though at that time, it seems like global collaboration, bilateral collaboration between US and China faced significant obstacles, but did China or the US, especially China, individually continue to address those issues?
Sure. Yeah, that was a major pivot, of course, from the U.S. Perspective. Fortunately, just speaking quickly first on the Trump administration, I think fortunately Trump's pulling of the U.S. from the Paris Agreement had to follow specific rules that had been well designed and established by that agreement, which meant that it required several years effectively to take effect. President Biden then prioritized U.S. re-entry to the agreement upon his assumption of the U.S. presidency. So the impact, while psychologically significant, I think, for the credibility of the U.S. globally, was minimal in reality. I think we should always remember, of course, that the U.S., if we look at the U.S. just right in the beginning here, we face a lot of urgent challenges, right, in this regard in terms of climate. We emit over 6 billion tons of CO2 annually. We share much of the blame, of course, when it comes to global warming. We're behind schedule in the U.S. in terms of our reduction targets. We remain the biggest contributor in the world when it comes to cumulative, so historical emissions, which is critical. I would say, from the U.S. perspective, probably a lot more progress, which we'll talk about maybe later, has been achieved at the state and regional level. When in the United States, places like California, have established cap and trade markets, and the U.S. Northeast, we have a great regional cap and trade. There's even increasing agreements with Canada and some of these states. So I think when it comes to China, it's incredibly interesting, of course. One is China's continued to make significant progress when it comes to clean energy. It is the world's largest solar market, wind market, carbon market. The role of coal in China's national energy system has declined meaningfully from about 70% of primary energy consumption to just under 60% in about 20 years, which for some nation and a market the size of China is real. And so I think the benefits of a lot of those changes, not just in the energy structure, right? So the way energy is produced, but also on the environmental side, environmental policies, some of which are related to climate and emissions, some of which are related to health and much more regional local environmental challenges have been real. So if you look at basically the health and the environmental and sustainability policies that have been advanced over the past 10 to 15 years, the results are pretty clear. I mean, China's percentage drop, for example, in air pollution that most recently have been achieved took the U.S. decades to do. So if you look at just the period between 2013 and 2020, China accounted for about 3/4 of the global decline in air pollution. That was a great recent study by University of Chicago showed that. So what does that mean? It means that you could think of it two ways. One is Beijingers, people living in Beijing, as you did and I did, can now expect to live about a little over 4.5 years longer than they would have with the air pollution at 2013 levels, and even the national life expectancy as a result of all of these policies has increased by about 2 years. So there has been change. It has been progress.
So it feels like if you just look at these two countries, right, political will at the highest level obviously plays a major role. And so the changing political will in the United States because of the administration changes plays a role, but it sounds like if, it wasn't long enough, the impact may not have been as significant as seen from, Obama to Trump administration and now to the Biden administration. Whereas in China, perhaps, and how much is the governance or the political system issue? Because, the Chinese government continues, right? There's no sort of political party changes, and therefore they're able to continue their priorities, which includes, addressing the climate change issues, despite sort of the external political global environment. Would you say, is that like a close to accurate assessment?
Yeah, no, Wenji, no, you're right. I mean, there are, one way of thinking about it is from the perspective of governance and governance systems. When you look at progress in the United States, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has had significant wins over the decades. So the federal government has played an important role, and particularly in establishing minimum standards that have to be met, right, across the many states. So we have a federal government, obviously, and that federal government has a role. However, I would say the largest difference is the ability, particularly when it comes to energy policy. It's very hard for the U.S. to have a national energy policy. In the end of the day, even in the environmental side, many of our sources of progress have come from the states. And as a result, you're right that once you start getting into cross-border, cross-state integration or coordination, which is often needed, whether it's because pollution, of course, itself crosses borders, political borders, or because in the end, the infrastructure needed to change both the energy footprint and the emissions footprint itself crosses political borders and is usually capital intensive and networked. When you have a highly fragmented political system, as we do in the United States, a decentralized federal one, yes, it then makes it very difficult for very mundane reasons, right? Simple logistics around right of way. You want a high-speed rail. How do you do high-speed rail? Well, you need to use public eminent domain and public power, right, to do that. So that's on the one hand. Also around urban planning, massively important, right, to meet these goals. Much harder to coordinate in the United States because of also even not just between states but within cities, right? Harder. So yes, whereas on the Chinese side, the not just the idea of one party, which is critical. As you state, in the United States, we tend to flip parties and party powers back and forth. I think more importantly, when it comes to eminent domain, when it comes to issues of capital intensive investment in infrastructure, it is true that there is a dividend in that sense. Of course, again, provinces themselves will push back, right? So there's always, we often use that phrase, right? That at the end of the day, while there are many policies that are put in place, right, there's always countermeasures from the bottom.
So that is my question. So the changes of how intense, I would say, those efforts are also depends on economic, the balancing act between economic growth as well as the need for addressing pollutions and climate change, right? And that is maybe something that's quite unique in China in the sense that as you mentioned, right, we both lived in China during a time, and perhaps me more so, during a time it was the peak of pollution. And so I do remember the central government somehow does have the power to switch on and off in terms of how much they want factories to continue operate with coal burning practices or not, right? So temporarily, for example, during any of the significant political gatherings, they would switch off. So then all of a sudden you see blue sky for a couple weeks, for maybe a couple days, but then it switched back for economic growth, or during Chinese New Year, for example, then it's blue sky again. So that is like fascinating, obviously. So given where China's economic development is, and balancing economic growth and addressing sort of those structural economic issues is so essential to China's ability to deliver its commitment to reducing CO2 emissions. How is China thinking about all this?
Yes. So, you're right. It is fascinating. It's fascinating to both to live through, but also, of course, to see that while, yes, we often did see the impact of those policies through blue skies for the Olympics and other Daohui and specific events. I remember also the incredible frustration that both the government felt, but also the industrial players, right? The actual power utility, the grids, the national grid, the southern grid, and the power producers had, or the manufacturers, because it didn't, of course, it's such a complicated system and such a complicated goal that it didn't always match that well, right? So yes, on the one hand, I think you're right. Certainly that level of control you don't see in the United States. On the other hand, atmospheric science is so complicated that oftentimes they weren't able to achieve what they actually wanted to achieve within the precise time. So it was to me, both an example of the power of the government, but also a bit the limits of its power, right? So what does that mean? When I think about it, there's still a lot of progress, right? So when you talk about trade-offs, effective is what you're asking about, right? Balancing economic growth and addressing these concerns for the environment. There's still a lot of progress. There's been so much progress, as I just mentioned. However, like many things in China, I think it's going to be much harder to make the additional progress that is needed. So what does that mean? Well, yes. Coal, when you look at coal and it's dropped from 70 to under 60%, that's great. It's meaningful. But as just one example, if you look at that number of about 11, 12% drop, it's not driven solely by gains in solar and wind, for example, right? So if you look at the national share of just fossil fuels, like other fossil fuels, oil, gas, they actually grew by 5% during that time, right? 2000 to 2020. And that's a little bit just below a 6% growth in renewables and nuclear. So coal is dropping, but oil and gas are rising. So if you look, so what does that mean? It means that on that same University of Chicago, that same team that just had the study that came out recently, they found that while there's been a lot of progress, if China were to meet WHO guidelines, let's say for air pollution, as you mentioned, stricter than China's, well, then Chinese citizens would gain another 2.5 years of life expectancy. So there's only so much you can do. I lived through when I did my doctoral work, research work in China in the mid 2000s. What I was doing was running around looking at scrubbers in coal-fired power plants. How are they dealing with SO2? Like those kinds of questions. There's only so much and they did. I mean, unbelievable installation rates. But there's only so much you can do with scrubbers, for example. Only so much you can do improving auto fuel, which are important, but auto fuel standards. So what I think is increasingly clear is that the additional progress needed is really running against what you're talking about, which is structural challenges that the CCP, right, has found. So those trade-offs in the end are very real because they're competing priorities of ensuring energy and heat supply and then maintaining growth, right? So in the end, coal output is going to remain stubbornly high because heavy industry plays a crucial role. It will continue as long as those subsidies remain in place and the government tries to maintain economic growth rates in the face of a declining growth rate by Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's where I think finance plays another really significant role, right?
Yes.
So again, I remember when I was living in China for one of the biggest investment banks, and there was so much conversation around how we can use leverage finance to actually encourage not just scientific research, but the whole new green industry, right, and innovations, because it's not just looking at reducing current emissions, but it's also finding newer ways to spur economic growth without sort of the traditional old way of fuel consumption. And that was very much led by the People's Bank of China, the central bank, and there was a lot of sort of central bank interests and even initiatives. And how's that going so far?
Yes, you're right. So there's really two things that are happening when it comes to green finance. One is the many of the commercial banks, right? So the one I'm thinking about in particular is China Construction Bank, that has a significant portfolio, obviously, around the built environment in China. They have spent several years to respond to a series of policy initiatives to increase green bonds, for example, right? Yes. So bonds in which, rather than the traditional terms of return, are based on profit, effectively. You also have other metrics that are more ESG, right? That are either largely environmental in terms of their avoided carbon, or are social in terms of their clear economic benefit to underprivileged groups, marginalized communities, right? So that's an example of where China Construction Bank, who I know much better, particularly given their outsized impact on construction in particular, they have been able to increase their portfolio around green bonds. So yes, that debt market has changed pretty remarkably in China in terms of the size of those green bond issuances. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is green finance is significant and growing in China. On the other hand, there are challenges to making sure that additionality tests are actually met, meaning yes, these bonds are important, but in the end of and clean development mechanisms, for example, the CDMs are important in terms of EU, for example, allowing EU money to support Chinese greener projects. The real challenge is, how do we monitor, report, verify that these projects wouldn't have been built anyway, right? So you have to basically show that because of this money, we're avoiding certain carbon emissions. And that's not so easy to do, because often some of those projects would have been built anyway. So the money either from the CDM didn't have an impact, or the green loan. On the other hand, you also have to be able to measure that over time and then verify and report it, right? So it's important. Green finance is growing, particularly in the bonds side of things, but that just creates a little bit more pressure to have sophisticated mechanisms in place for accounting and governance, right?
Yeah. And I think I want to sort of come back to the government's role, right? So in China, we see a lot of sort of government-led initiatives, especially when it comes to private sector finance and innovations. And in the US, as you said, the government can play a more limited role, but more rhetorical and on the policy level. So when President Biden came to the office, he promised a clean energy revolution that would basically both slash emissions and strengthen the economy. And then he appointed, former Secretary of State John Kerry as a special presidential envoy for climate. So there was a lot of hope that the US and China would jointly lead climate efforts. But as we all know, this relationship kind of has changed significantly since the Obama administration. And so what are the two countries working on together if there's any joint effort? And something came out of, Glasgow. And can you just kind of share what are they? Are the two countries actually working towards making something happen, or something has happened?
Yes, so it's a great question. If I start from the end, the last part of your question, when it comes to Glasgow, I think that what's at least from my perspective, what's so important is we really didn't have. This is sort of where it gets governance and wonky, I suppose, but we really didn't have. Paris asked for specific metrics, right? How do we actually hold these nations to task? How do we agree on metrics that are common? And how do we finance a lot of this work, particularly in the developing world? What I think is so important about Glasgow is that those metrics were agreed upon. A reporting mechanism system was agreed upon. And even though this has been less successful to date, at least there's been, while low levels, there's been increasing financing for the developing world from the developed world, but not enough, obviously. So Glasgow is important in the sense that those additional sophisticated, more specific, sophisticated, nuanced ecosystem issues were agreed upon, and those are necessary for Paris to work properly, right? So that I think we shouldn't lose track of. The other piece is what you're asking is really, okay, US and China have significant political tensions. What's happening? You're right. There's only so much that John Kerry as special envoy can do. One of the biggest points, structural challenges he faces, I think, is that he is trying to separate out climate from everything else and to say, look, this is global common good, a public good. We both have responsibility here, and we have significant levers we can pull, so we need to focus on that. From the Chinese perspective, which I also understand, I understand the US strategy, makes sense. We're not going to get anywhere on these issues. These are going to get worse, actually, in many ways. We want to focus on this. The Chinese perspective is trying to reintegrate, right, these issues to say, no, you're not going to do that. It's not divide and conquer. We first want to talk about trade and about the tariffs that you've put in place. We want to talk about some of these other trade agreements that you're entering. We talk a little bit about the security issues, and then also climate. What's interesting about that is it's flipped the traditional role. So usually what's happening is China is the one that's trying to be bilateral, both in terms of the way it operates, right, and also split human rights, and political issues from economic issues. And it's kind of ironic that the U.S., in some ways, we flipped roles. They're trying to integrate what we're trying to split, right? So that's the fundamental challenge, I think, for someone like Kerry. So where are the wins? Just to finish that thought. Well, the wins are actually vis-a-vis China, showing the ways in which, with other countries, Vietnam is a perfect example, we are moving forward and we are getting wins in terms of not just agreements and trade agreements, but also clean energy, green energy policies, and coordination that put pressure on the Chinese to respond in kind, right, to that. So, but it has challenged. I think that structural difference has challenged.
Right. Because, I mean, again, this is not limited to just the bilateral kind of coordination. It does require the global sort of cooperation and collaboration. However, and Glasgow happened, November last year, and then Ukraine and Russia war. Kind of has upended the world. So the priority of kind of developing this renewable energy has been sort of overtaken by the need to control high oil prices, inflation, and then be tough on Russia. So how has the war changed the conversation about energy security? In particular, how is China thinking about all this?
Yes, good. That's a great question. It's one of the most interesting ones that we face these days when we're trying to analyze, right, what's going on. I think let's talk maybe the short term versus the medium term. So short term, Russia is the world's largest oil exporter to global markets. It's natural gas, critical to the EU, European economies. We've, in some ways, short term, we've seen this movie, right? So this isn't the first time that Russian military action has forced leaders, particularly in Europe, to worry about their security, their energy security.
Energy security in particular.
Exactly, energy security, exactly. So we saw those concerns when Russia invaded Georgia, right? The Republic of Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014. But this time we're seeing, because it's so close to home and it's so significant in scale, we're seeing short-term Germany halting approval of that newly built gas pipeline from Russia, starting to think about basically planning importing liquefied natural gas from basically Qatar, so Middle East and the US. Other countries like Belgium is now thinking through its exit from nuclear power, maybe not going to do that. Italy, UK,
But
Dutch.
how is China? Yeah, let's focus on China.
Oh,
How's
sure.
China thinking about all this?
So I think in the short term, right there, what China is doing then is this is an opportunity, of course, right, to access cheaper energy supplies from an important historical energy partner like Russia. So that's number one. Number two, so that's on the fossil side of things. So pretty big opportunity for China to take advantage of that. Because of course, because of embargoes, Russia wants to sell and can sell at a now cheaper price. The second, I think, which is in some ways more interesting, is China in the medium term sees, I think, Chinese companies and certainly the government view this also as an opportunity to export not only its own standards around the renewable piece, but also its own its own products and services. So if in the end, European nations, right, are shifting away, at least in the short term, and probably in the medium term, are arguing we're going to try to be more resilient and be more self-sufficient. What that means in the medium term, as opposed to the short term, is that they need to build much more responsive, decentralized, more renewable abilities to produce power, right, to produce energy. What that means is for a lot of Chinese companies, they're able to provide EPC, other services, as well as panels, as well as wind turbines to do that. And so I think on the other side, the medium term, I think China's also viewing it as an opportunity, but not on just the fossil side, but on the renewable side as well.
Fascinating. So it's an opportunity for actually more conversation around alternative energy supply.
Right.
And China sees that as an opportunity, obviously, because they've been focusing on it for over, the last decade or so.
That's why you can export a lot of that capability.
Yeah. Well, since we're talking about governance issue, I like to invite Professor Weida Fang, Director of the Graduate Institute of Environmental Education at National Taiwan Normal University, to ask a question.
Hello, I think my question is quite simple because we find some significance between the word just being changed. So what is the beneficial if we like a citizen, we face the increase of the green technology, or maybe we got the price rise. So how do you think if we got some price issues, how can we use green energy compared to traditional gasoline or any use of the energy? Yeah, that's my questions.
So how is it sort of about how to convince the people, the citizens, that paying more is good for environment?
Yeah, because it's beneficial to our climate change.
Society.
I think the price is the key issues, I think.
No, that's a great question. I think it is one of the central questions particularly for Taiwan. So I think that we always have to remember, right, given what we've just been talking about, that in the end, Paris, Glasgow, they lack enforcement mechanisms, right? So, but what they've done is they provide these clear goals, right? These action plans, and that means that citizens, NGOs, activists, corporations, local governments all have very specific targets now that they can use, right, to pressure for more action. So what you're getting to is, I think, the critical context. If cleaner energy is expensive, some people will not want it, basically, right? And that's because energy is a commodity and it's highly price sensitive as a result because it's a commodity. Even worse, I think this really gets to what you're asking, the end consumer often has no idea if the electricity, for example, is green or is black, right? So the behavior really just depends on price. So I think you're right to focus on this sensitivity to cost. A friend of mine, Amory Lovins, who is in many ways a fascinating individual, and he founded the Rocky Mountain Institute. basically he's argued that for decades. And what he said is people don't want energy, right? They want a hot shower and a cold beer. That was always the phrase he uses. And he says it's like when you go to the hardware store and you're looking for a drill. What you really want is not a drill. You want a hole, right? You need to create a hole. So the real question really is, why do you want that hole? So let's go back to really your question. It's asking that what then that leads to good governance, which I think is sort of good design. So the reality is that high oil and gas prices today, back to your question, your point, Wenqi, about the war, are further enabling the already dramatic drops in cost, right? For wind and for solar, for example, globally, to the point where in many parts of the world, they're competitive, right, with new build coal plants. So even better, as Amory has shown in his work, or Germany has shown in their build out, building standards, efficient design of buildings, industrial plants, homes, transport, and many other users of energy have led to massive cost savings in the design phase, right? That allow this renewable energy to be much cheaper, more attractive. So I guess I would push back a little bit in the sense that, yes, it can be more expensive in certain circumstances, but renewables are increasingly competitive, number one. And number two, if governance is used to improve design, right, for the end user, then it can drop even further. And so you no longer have that trade-off. So I'm still quite optimistic in the sense that we are seeing significant gains, and the high oil and gas prices of today only reinforce that trend. So I think for consumers in Taiwan, as an example, it's appreciation of that trend that I think would encourage their adoption.
Yeah, I just think about the motivation of our citizen society. Yeah, so it's maybe we need to think about its motivation. So another one is our moral. We need to think about for environmental behaviors for our citizen society.
Yeah. I think ultimately this is a fascinating topic because it brings in so many different parts of society, right? It's government, it's the private sector, it's also the citizens tackling an issue that cannot be controlled just by one particular actor. And so this is, again, I think a lot of people think, governments ultimately play the biggest role because you're supposed to bring the private sector together. You're supposed to educate the citizens, but not just on the moral side of things, but also on the incentives, right? Because ultimately people are not going to sacrifice too much if they are not going to enjoy, a cold shower on a very hot day. So, with that, I know we're over time, but just wanted to thank both of you for joining us for this conversation. This is a really important topic. I know, unfortunately, during this time, I feel like this topic has been lost in the overall conversation about the wars and other topics, but hopefully it'll gain attraction again because it's about our Earth. So thank you so much for joining us, Edward and Professor Fang, and thank you for watching us.
Thank you very much, Wenqi.
Great to be here. Thanks, Wenqi.
Thank you, Ed.
Fang.
Bye. Bye.